"You're not our problem anymore." That's what my mother said as she handed me a garbage bag with everything I owned inside it. I was 17 years old. I hadn't done anything wrong. I just wasn't the child they wanted. And the morning they drove away from that shelter, I made myself a promise. One day they would need something from me, and I would remember exactly how this felt. 10 years later, they didn't just come knocking. They sent lawyers, and I answered the door with a smile they had never seen on my face before. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Mara, and for the first 17 years of my life, I believed that if I just worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, caused no trouble, asked for nothing, maybe, my parents would finally see me the way they saw my sister Jade. Jade was the dream. Jade was the story they told at dinner parties. She had her mother's eyes and her father's ambition, and everyone said so constantly, as if I wasn't sitting right there at the same table with a fork in my hand and nothing on my plate worth mentioning. I don't say this with bitterness anymore. I say it because it's true and because you deserve to understand what I was working with. From the time I was small, the household ran on a kind of invisible math, an accounting of worth that I could never quite balance, no matter what I contributed. Jade got the new school clothes at the start of every year. I got what didn't fit her anymore. Jade got tutoring in subjects she already excelled at. I taught myself with library books and YouTube videos and free internet at the coffee shop 2 blocks down when our home Wi-Fi got password protected and I somehow wasn't given the new one. Jade had birthday parties with themes and friends and cakes my mother spent whole weekends designing. My birthdays were acknowledged with a card, sometimes, and a reminder that I was another year closer to being self-sufficient. I told myself these were small things. I told myself I was being dramatic. My stepfather Martin used that word a lot. Dramatic. Every time I said something felt unfair, every time I pointed to a pattern I could see clearly, he would lean back in his chair and say, "Mara, don't be dramatic." And somehow that phrase became a door slamming in my face so regularly that I stopped knocking. There was the school trip to Washington when I was 12. Every student in my grade went, every student except me, because the deposit was due the same week Jade needed new equipment for her extracurriculars, and there was only so much money to go around, and the decision of where it went was never really a question. I sat in the empty classroom for 3 days with the substitute while my classmates were in the Capitol, taking photographs in front of monuments I'd only ever seen in textbooks. When they came back and talked about it for weeks, I nodded and smiled and said it sounded amazing. Martin said I could go next year. There was no trip next year. There was the time I made the honor roll for the 3rd consecutive semester, and my mother said good and went back to the phone call she was on. The same month, Jade got a B+ on a chemistry test she'd been struggling with, and my mother took her out for ice cream to celebrate. I remember standing in the kitchen, watching them pull out of the driveway through the window. I remember the particular quality of that silence, heavy and instructive. I filed it. I kept filing. There was the family portrait they had taken when I was 14, the one that ended up framed in the living room and on my mother's desk at work and in the holiday cards sent to relatives. Martin, my mother, Jade, smiling in front of the oak tree in the yard on a bright October afternoon. I was in the house when it was taken. I was not in the photograph. My mother said it had been a spontaneous thing, that she hadn't planned it that way, that she hadn't thought. And maybe that was true. Maybe that was exactly true. Maybe she genuinely hadn't thought. I'm not sure which version of events is more revealing. What I know is that every year after that, I looked at the card on the mantle at Christmas and understood exactly what the frame meant, who this family included, and who it was comfortable leaving out. There was the summer I was 15 when Jade got to go to a language immersion program in another state for 6 weeks. I heard my mother on the phone describing it to a friend, saying, "Jade is really coming into her own this summer." I was in the kitchen making dinner because it was one of my 3 nights, chopping vegetables, listening, coming into her own. I thought about that phrase for a long time. I wondered if there was a version of me that was also coming into her own somewhere, in some other house, in some other life that had gone differently. I decided there probably was. I decided to carry her around with me. That other Mara, the one in the better story. I carried her forward like a compass point. The thing about growing up like that is you learn to read rooms. You learn to sense the temperature of a space before you enter it. You learn to make yourself small, not to disappear, but to survive, to take up only the space you've been allotted and not 1 inch more. I became excellent at school because school was somewhere I had some control. Teachers noticed me. A few of them really saw me. Mrs. Delacroix in 7th grade English, who put my essay on the bulletin board and told me I had a voice worth hearing. Mr. Asante in 10th grade, who stayed after class to help me with my college prep applications, even though college prep wasn't technically part of what he was paid for. These people gave me small things that kept me going. Approval, attention, evidence that I existed and mattered in some room somewhere. At home, I was efficient. I cooked dinner 3 nights a week without being asked because I understood that contribution was my currency. I kept my room immaculate because cleanliness felt like armor. I babysat for neighbors on weekends and handed half of every payment to my mother, not because she asked, but because I was always trying to justify my presence. Because I had absorbed this idea, somewhere deep and foundational, in the way children absorb things, that my place in that household was conditional, that I was there on a kind of renewable lease, and the renewal was never quite guaranteed. I was 16 when the first real crack appeared. Not in my understanding of what was happening. I think I always understood, but in my ability to keep pretending it wasn't happening. Jade had gotten into a private college, expensive, the kind of place that gets announcements made about it and banners hung in front yards. My mother had a celebratory dinner with the good dishes and wine she'd been saving, and she cried, actually cried, with joy. Martin gave a toast and called Jade his greatest achievement with a catch in his voice. And I sat there and I clapped and I smiled and I felt something go quiet in me. Not dead, just quiet. Like a candle being shielded from wind by a careful hand. I was quiet for the rest of the year. I applied to colleges on my own, using an email account they didn't know about, and a school counselor named Miss Price, who printed my applications for free and mailed them herself because she said every student deserved a fair shot, regardless of what was happening at home. I didn't tell my parents I applied. I don't know what I was expecting. Some version of myself believed that if I got in somewhere, if I had an acceptance letter in my hand, it would change the math, that it would prove something they'd refused to see. I was accepted to 3 schools. One of them had a merit scholarship attached. I waited until a Sunday morning when the house was calm to bring it downstairs and set it on the kitchen table. My mother looked at the letter for a long moment. Martin leaned over her shoulder and read it. Then he looked at me and said, "We don't have the money for this, Mara. You know that." I said I had a scholarship. He said it wasn't enough. I said I could take loans, I could work, I could figure it out. And then my mother said the things she'd been not saying my entire life. She said, "Jade's education is our priority right now. We only have so much to give." I didn't say anything. I folded the letter back up. I went upstairs, and I sat on the edge of my bed, and I held my own hands for a long time, and I thought, okay, now I know. I turned 17 that spring. I got a card. 2 months after my birthday, on a Tuesday, a nothing day, an unremarkable weekday afternoon. Martin knocked on my bedroom door and told me they had been doing some thinking. He said it carefully, in that particular way he had when he was about to say something that required careful saying. He said Jade needed a proper study space for when she came home from college. He said my room was the largest bedroom not being used by the two of them. He said they thought it would make sense if I found somewhere else to stay. He said it so calmly, like he was discussing a minor furniture rearrangement, like I was a piece of furniture. I remember the silence that came out of my own mouth before the words did. I remember the way the room seemed to tilt, the way a picture frame tilts in an earthquake, almost imperceptible until suddenly nothing is level. I said, where am I supposed to go? My mother appeared in the doorway behind him and she said, "You're practically an adult, Mara. You're 17. Plenty of people your age support themselves." I said I was a minor. I said this was illegal. Martin said the shelter downtown was safe and clean and they'd done their research. They had done their research. They'd already looked it up. They'd planned this. The garbage bag was already in the corner of the room. I hadn't even noticed it come in. My mother had already packed it. I found out later she'd done it 3 days earlier. She had packed a garbage bag with my things 3 days before she told me. That is the sentence that still takes my breath sometimes, even now. She had already decided. She had already packed. She just hadn't told me yet. Martin drove me to the shelter. My mother didn't come. The ride was 11 minutes. I counted them because I had nothing else to do with my mind. When we pulled up, he put the car in park and waited. I got out. I got my bag. I stood on the sidewalk. He rolled the window down and he said, "You're a capable girl, Mara. You'll be fine." And then he drove away. I watched the taillights until they disappeared around a corner and the street was just a street again. The street light above me buzzed and flickered. The night was warm and smelled like exhaust and cut grass. And I stood there with a garbage bag at my feet, and I made myself a promise, not out loud, just inside, in that quiet, candle-careful place. I said I will build something. I will build something real and solid and entirely mine. And one day they will need something from me. And when that day comes, I will remember every single minute of the sidewalk. The shelter was managed by a woman named Diane, who had kind eyes and a no-nonsense handshake, and who did not treat me like a disaster. She showed me the room I'd be sharing, explained the rules, handed me a schedule of available resources, and said, "You're not the first kid dropped here by people who should have known better, and you won't be the last. What matters now is what you do next." That was it. No pity speech, no soft music, just, "Here are your tools, here is the door, what do you do next?" I decided, standing in that small room with its 2 cots and its single window and its faint smell of industrial cleaner, that I would do everything. I would do everything next. Miss Price, my school counselor, came to see me when she found out what happened. She drove herself on a Saturday on her own time, and when Diane brought her to where I was sitting in the common room, she took one look at me and pressed her lips together in that way people do when they are holding back something very large. She sat across from me and she said, "Tell me everything." So I did. I told her all of it. Not just the last Tuesday, but all of it. The years of it. Every piece I had been filing away for so long, it had become almost neatly organized in my own memory. The Wi-Fi password, the portrait, the honor roll, and the ice cream trip for Jade's B+. The college letter folded back up and carried upstairs. She listened with her hands flat on the table and her eyes steady on mine, and she did not once say, "Don't be dramatic." When I finished, she sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to help you. I want you to know that clearly." She was furious in a composed, professional way that I had never seen an adult be furious on my behalf before. It wasn't loud. It was still and deliberate and aimed, like a good attorney's argument. She sat with Diane and she made phone calls and she got me connected to a legal aid organization that confirmed what I'd suspected. What my parents had done existed in a murky gray zone, not clean-cut illegal, but certainly not right, and my options were limited, but not zero. I turned 18 7 months after the shelter. Those 7 months, I stayed, I attended school, I didn't miss a single day, I got a part-time job at a grocery store 2 bus rides away, I saved every dollar I could, and I applied for every scholarship and grant I could find on Diane's shared shelter computer after my shifts. Some nights I'd be at that computer until Diane gently reminded me the common room closed at 10. I'd walk back to my shared room, lie on my cot in the dark, and do math in my head. Tuition numbers, living costs, interest rates, timelines, until the numbers steadied my breathing and I could sleep. I shared the room with a girl named Yolanda who was 19 and had a baby daughter being temporarily cared for by her aunt, and who cried sometimes at night, quietly on her side of the room. I never said anything about the crying. She never said anything about the late night math I did out loud in a whisper. We understood each other without having to explain it. Some mornings we'd make instant oatmeal together in the common kitchen, and she would tell me about her daughter, and I would listen, and it felt, those mornings, like something almost like ordinary life. I think about Yolanda sometimes. I hope she got her daughter back. I hope things worked out. A woman named Rosalind, who volunteered at the shelter on Thursdays, helped me with my financial aid forms. She was patient in a way that felt almost foreign. She would read through my answers, say, "Good, now say it again, but more specifically," and wait while I rewrote until it was right, never once sighing or checking her watch. A man named Gerald, who'd been a corporate accountant before his own unraveling. Let me ask him questions about money and budgeting on Wednesday evenings in the common room, and he always answered like I was asking something smart. He gave me a worn paperback book about personal finance that he said had changed the way he understood the world. I still have that book. It lives on my desk. These people, Diane, Miss Price, Rosalind, Gerald, Yolanda, I think about them still. Not as chapter characters in my story, as people who handed me something essential when they had no obligation to do so. When I turned 18, I had a job, a bank account, a partial scholarship to a state university, and an understanding of compound interest that most people twice my age don't have. I moved into student housing and I didn't look back. I didn't call. They didn't call either. University was where I stopped performing and started becoming. No one there knew the narrative my family had written for me. The difficult one, the dramatic one, the burden. I was just Mara, a girl from somewhere, working hard, asking good questions, showing up. I studied business and finance because I wanted to understand the mechanics of independence. I wanted to know exactly how money moved and where it went, and how to build something that couldn't be taken by someone deciding your room was more useful for someone else. I worked all 4 years. 2 jobs at times, 1 job always. The coffee shop at 6 in the morning before early classes. The library front desk in the evenings. I learned to study in 40-minute windows between shifts, to sleep efficiently, to eat cheap and well, to say no to things that cost money, and yes to every free lecture, every open networking event, every professor who offered office hours. I made friends, real ones, the kind you choose rather than inherit. A girl named Petra who was studying economics and who had her own complicated story and who never once made me feel like my background was something to be managed. A quiet, funny guy named Dom who was in 2 of my finance classes and who lent me his textbooks when mine hadn't arrived and asked nothing in return. These people were the first evidence I had accumulated that chosen bonds could be steadier than obligatory ones, that the family you find can hold you in ways the family you're given sometimes won't. I held on to that evidence carefully. I had a mentor in my 3rd year, a professor named Dr. Osei, who ran the investment analysis club and who pulled me aside after I'd presented a case study he said was the sharpest he'd seen from an undergraduate in years. He said, "You understand consequence. Most people your age are still learning that choices have weight. You already know it. It shows in everything you do." He didn't know where that understanding came from. I didn't explain. I just thanked him and went back to work. I graduated with honors and a job offer from a financial consulting firm in the city. My first apartment was small and mine. I stood in it the first night and I touched the walls. My walls, my lease, my name on the utility bill, my name on the mailbox. There is a feeling available to people who have had their agency taken that most people who grew up secure will never quite understand. The feeling of a thing being yours for real, fully, unconditionally. No one could pack it in a bag while you slept. It was mine in a way nothing had ever been mine before. I called Petra from the floor of that empty apartment and she said, "Mara, you did it." And I said, "I know." And we both stayed on the line for a while, not saying much else, because there wasn't much else that needed saying. I climbed in the years that followed. I was good at my work because I understood risk from the inside, because I had learned to do careful math in environments that didn't reward mistakes, because I had been reading rooms since I was 6 years old. By 25, I had moved into a senior analyst role. By 27, I had started consulting independently on the side, building a small client list through referrals, doing work so thorough that people handed my name to other people without being asked. By 28, I had bought a property, a small one, 2 bedrooms, the first place I'd ever owned. And the morning I got the keys, I sat on the empty floor and I cried. Not from sadness, from the weight of the thing, the actual physical weight of having built something solid from what they left me with. I thought about that sidewalk. I thought about the buzzing streetlight. I thought about the garbage bag and the 11 minutes in the car and the window that rolled down and then closed again. I thought, look where we are now. Look at what we made from the beginning they handed us. I had not spoken to my parents in nearly 10 years. Not a word, not a text, not a birthday acknowledgement in either direction. I knew from occasional mutual acquaintances, people from my old neighborhood who found me online, that Jade had moved home after college with some debt, that Martin had retired early, that my mother's health had become complicated. I processed that information the way you process weather, noting it, filing it, moving on. I was not waiting for contact. I had genuinely built a life in which they occupied no active space, which is why, on a Thursday morning in autumn, when a legal envelope arrived at my office address, my first feeling wasn't dread. It was something closer to recognition, like a chapter I'd always known was coming had finally turned its page. The letter was from an attorney. It explained that my father, Martin, and I noticed they used the word father without qualification, as if that word were settled and uncontested, was facing a significant financial difficulty. A business investment had collapsed. There were debts. My mother's health situation required ongoing expensive care. And there was a matter of a property, a piece of land that had been in Martin's family, that was now central to a legal dispute and in which, through a chain of circumstances too long to detail here, my name had become technically relevant. What they wanted, the letter explained in several careful paragraphs of legal language, was cooperation and resources. They were, with great delicacy and several euphemisms, asking me for help. I read the letter twice. I set it down on my desk next to Gerald's worn paperback. I looked out my office window at the city, and I thought about a Tuesday afternoon and a garbage bag and 11 minutes in a car and a window rolled down and taillights disappearing into a street that became just a street again. And then I picked up my phone and I called my own attorney, My attorney's name is Christine, and she is methodical and warm and completely without sentimentality in professional matters, which is exactly what I needed. I walked her through everything: the full history, the property matter, the letter, the 10 years. She listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes on a legal pad with a ballpoint pen, the scratch of it the only sound in the room besides my voice. When I finished, she set the pen down and she said, "So, what do you want the outcome to be?" And I sat with that question longer than I expected, because what I'd promised myself on that sidewalk wasn't revenge exactly. Revenge is hot and consuming, and I had spent a decade doing something colder and more useful with my energy. What I wanted was clarity. I wanted the accounting to finally be visible. I wanted the math done out loud in a room with witnesses. I wanted the record to exist somewhere outside my own memory, documented, dated, real in the way that things on paper are real, in a way that feelings aren't always allowed to be. I told Christine that. She nodded like it made complete sense, which it did. Christine drafted a response to their attorneys that was 2 pages long and contained, among other things, a detailed record of my minor years, the shelter placement, the timeline, the documentation Miss Price had kept, and a very clear statement that any cooperation I might consider providing would require a formal meeting, in person, with all relevant parties present. Their attorneys called back in 4 days. The meeting was scheduled for 3 weeks out. I spent those 3 weeks preparing, not emotionally. I had done that work years before, in therapy, in journals, in the long, deliberate project of becoming someone who was not destroyed by what had been done to her, but practically. I organized documents into a binder, tabbed and ordered. I called Miss Price and asked if she would be willing to write a statement. She said yes without a pause. She said she had been waiting for a reason to put it in writing for years. I prepared my own statement and read it aloud to myself in my kitchen, adjusted the places where my voice went tight, read it again until it came out level and clear, the way I needed it to be. I wore the suit I'd bought with my first real bonus, not because I needed armor, but because I had earned the right to walk into that room looking exactly like what I was. The night before, I sat on the floor of my living room, my floor in my home, with my name on the deed, and I held Gerald's book in my hands for a while, not reading it, just holding it, the way you hold something that means I made it. Then I set it on the table, went to bed, and slept clean through the night. They were already seated when I arrived. Martin, my mother, their attorney, a second man I didn't recognize. Martin looked older, softer in a way that wasn't kindness but erosion. My mother looked small. She had been a tall woman when I was a child, or she had seemed tall, the way powerful things seem tall to small children. And now she sat with her coat still on and her hands folded in her lap, and she looked genuinely like someone who understood the position she was in. I sat down across from them. The room was a standard conference room. Long table, water glasses, neutral carpet, a window with a view of buildings. Ordinary. I was grateful for the ordinariness of it. There was nothing dramatic to hide behind. Just a table and the people at it and the documentation in Christine's folder and 10 years worth of carefully built truth. My mother looked at me with something moving behind her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or grief, or the specific expression of a person seeing clearly for the first time a thing they have been carefully not seeing for years. She opened her mouth and said, "Mara, I'm so glad you..." And I said, quietly, without heat, "Let's let the attorneys speak first." Her mouth closed. The meeting ran for 2 hours. Their attorney opened by framing the request as a family matter, using the word family 4 times in the first 5 minutes. I counted. Christine let him finish without interruption, and then she opened the binder and set the documentation on the table and said simply, "Before we discuss the nature of the request, there is some relevant context." The legal picture around their situation was complicated and genuinely not entirely their fault. The property matter involved a third party who had misrepresented information to Martin, and the investment collapse had multiple causes. I'm not someone who celebrates suffering, even suffering that finds people who once handed me a garbage bag and a shelter address. But here is what I needed to happen in that room, and what happened. Their attorneys presented their request. My attorney presented our documentation. Every single thing that had been done, dated, and sourced: school records, shelter records, financial aid records, a letter from Ms. Price that she had written voluntarily when I called to tell her what was happening, in which she described in precise and professional language what she had observed during my adolescence: the Wi-Fi password, the portrait, the college letter, the Tuesday in the car, all of it, on paper, in a room, visible. Their attorney read the documentation with the kind of carefully neutral face that lawyers develop specifically for moments when they know the ground has shifted beneath everyone in the room. Martin's attorney shifted in his chair. Martin looked at his hands. He had the posture of a man who had spent years believing a story about himself and was watching someone place a different story on the table in front of him. My mother looked at me with an expression I had waited a decade to see. Not guilt exactly, not performance, but actual recognition. Like she was finally in the same room with what she had done, and it was smaller and larger than she had managed to let herself believe. I spoke once, toward the end, directly and only to them, with the attorneys silent on both sides. I said, "I spent 7 months in a shelter when I was 17 years old because you decided my room was more useful empty. I put myself through school. I built a career. I own property. I have a life I am genuinely proud of. I want you to understand that none of that happened because of anything you gave me. It happened in spite of what you took away." Martin started to say something. I held up one hand, just one gesture, and he stopped. I said, "I'm not here for an apology. I don't need one anymore. I'm here to tell you what is and isn't possible." What was possible was limited. I was not going to fund their legal defense or resolve their debts. The property matter, Christine had determined, did not actually require my cooperation. Their attorneys had overstated my relevance there, either through error or strategy. What I agreed to was one narrow documented provision related to a technical administrative matter that cost me nothing but an hour of paperwork, and I agreed to it not out of obligation, but out of the recognition that cruelty as a response to cruelty has never been the thing I was building toward. I stood up when it was over. I put on my coat. My mother said my name once, softly, like she was testing whether it still worked, and I paused. She said she was sorry, that she had been sorry for a long time. I looked at her, really looked, the way I hadn't allowed myself to look in years. And I said, "I believe you." And I meant it. Not as forgiveness in the full sense, not as an open door, but as truth. I believed her. The sorrow was real. It just didn't change the accounting. The door remained what it was. I walked out into an autumn afternoon with the city going about its ordinary business around me, and I stood on the sidewalk outside that building, and I felt the sun on my face, and I thought about 17-year-old Mara on a different sidewalk, with a different street light and a garbage bag, and the whole terrifying open question of what came next, And I thought, she did it. She really did it. Not in anger, not in triumph exactly, in completion. Jade reached out a month later through a message I didn't expect, saying she had heard what happened at the meeting and that she had always known things hadn't been fair, and she was sorry she'd never said so. I read that message 4 times. Jade and I had never been enemies. She hadn't orchestrated anything. She had simply been the beneficiary of a system she hadn't designed and hadn't questioned. That's a different kind of thing. She had been a child too, in a household with its own complicated physics, and she had moved through it the only way she knew how. I wrote back, not warmly, not coldly. I said I appreciated her saying so. I said I hoped she was well. I did not open a door, but I did not close one either. That felt right. Petra, when I told her about the message, said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I don't know yet." She said, "That's okay." And it was okay not to know. Martin has not contacted me. I did not expect him to, and I have nothing in particular to feel about that. Some people are not built for the accounting. Some people can only hold one version of themselves, and the version Martin holds doesn't have room for what that conference room contained. I don't need it to. My mother and I have exchanged 2 letters. Actual paper letters, written by hand, sent through the mail, in the month since the meeting. Careful, slow, measured. She writes about small things. The weather, a book she is reading, a memory from when I was very small, before the household became what it became. I write back in kind. I do not know what that becomes. I am not in a hurry to decide. I am done being in a hurry for things that require slowness. What I know is that I am not waiting for her to define me, and I am not waiting for her recognition to authorize my life. I authorized it myself a long time ago, on a sidewalk, in the dark, with a buzzing light overhead and everything I owned in a garbage bag at my feet. I kept one thing from that bag, a small photograph of myself at maybe 8 years old, standing alone in the backyard of that house, squinting into the sun, smiling at whoever was holding the camera. I don't remember who was holding the camera. I kept the photograph because it reminded me that I was there, that I existed in that house, that I was real and present and a child who deserved to be in the portrait and on the holiday card and on the school trip to Washington, that no one gets to rewrite that out of the record. It sits in a frame now on the windowsill of my home with my name on the deed and Gerald's worn paperback on my desk and Petra's number in my phone, and a life so full and solid that a garbage bag couldn't contain a fraction of it. The accounting has been settled. The math has been done. If you have ever been dropped somewhere and told you were not someone's problem, if you have ever been handed a garbage bag's worth of diminishment and heard a door close behind you, I want you to hear this. What they gave you was a beginning, not an ending. The accounting always comes due eventually, and the most powerful thing you can do is be standing at the door when it does, looking exactly like everything you built. Be ready. Take your time. Build the thing. Let them come to you.